Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Publion's Beyond the Ballot webinar on the European elections. We are delighted that you joined us today. In the next hour, we will provide you with exclusive insights on the European elections, exploring the current political landscape, evaluating the current term of the European Commission, and looking into how the strategic agenda for the coming 5 years may look like. Firstly, I would like to introduce you to our distinguished panelists today. Ms. Judith Arnall, Senior Research Fellow at the Center of European Policy Studies, and Mr. Igor Sarkisyan, Chief Policy Officer of One Policy Place. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation and being with us today. Before we start, I would like to remind all participants that we will observe Chatham House rules. We encourage active participation from the audience throughout the webinar, as your questions and insights will enrich the dialogue and contribute to the depth of the discussions. You can post your questions in the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. 2024 is a crucial year of the EU. In June, citizens across the 27 member states will elect the new members of the European Parliament, and later this year, the new European Commission will enter into office. Against the backdrop of rising concern over Vladimir Putin's Russia and the potential return to the White House for Donald Trump, an internal split over how to respond to both, a political shift is evident. But what does it mean for political priorities, and how can organizations grasp the opportunity to influence the strategic agenda? This year, we will also see many national elections, some of which likely result in notable change in governments and/or policy directions. We expect political fragmentation to remain a key trend in Europe. But before anticipating on the future, let's look back and assess how the EU performed in the past 5 years. The current von der Leyen Commission entered into office in late 2019 with ambitions to decarbonize the continent and make it pioneer in the digitalization. However, the plans were soon withered with the COVID-19 pandemic and the consequent economic downturn, and in the past 2 years also the war in Ukraine. The current Commission also faces heavy criticism about pushing through the European Green Deal without realizing its unintended consequences on the EU industry and the prosperity of the Union. As Emmanuel Macron said in May 2023, Europe risks being the best performer in terms of regulation and the worst performer in terms of financing. And that is indeed a serious concern of the EU industry stakeholders. When Ursula von der Leyen announced on Monday that she would seek a second term as European Commission President, decarbonization and net zero goals were hardly mentioned in her speech in Berlin. Instead, she made it clear that her re-election campaign will focus heavily on boosting the competitiveness of Europe's economy and the continent's military defense. And that was clearly also underlined by her presence in Antwerp on Tuesday, when the new European Industrial Deal was announced to complement the European Green Deal. A high-level industrial competitiveness declaration signed by EU heavyweights called for urgent legislative clarification, as well as predictability and confidence in Europe and its industrial policy. But can sustainability and climate targets be reconciled with competitiveness? Or is there a need to rethink the European Green Deal in order to reduce the burden on European companies and avoid that they either disappear or simply move outside the EU? Let's start our deep dive into these critical questions with our distinguished speakers. Judith, Igor, during the current mandate, we saw the European Commission focused heavily on fulfilling this net zero ambition, while also aiming at becoming a pioneer in digitalization. As we see the world around us is changing, priorities are also shifting. How do you look at the EU's priorities for the next term? Maybe we can start with Judith.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much, Victoria, for having me today, and also to Publium. It's a pleasure to be here. To your point, basically, First point I would like to make is that I am pretty impressed about how well the European Commission managed a series of crises, right? The perma crisis situation. We all know that coming to agreements and legislative procedures are pretty cumbersome in the EU. However, I think that we all reacted collectively very rapidly. So, I mean, myself being an economist, I can think of Next Generation EU, for instance, which to me is a revolution. We will discuss later whether it is here to stay or not. I can also think, for instance, about the Shore Instrument, the agreement on the fiscal rules, but even agreements on packages of sanctions. Yesterday, we learned about the 13th package. And on top of this, I think that the European Commission has done its best to become a geopolitical power. We will then again discuss whether they have fully achieved this aim or not. But to be very honest, I would tend to think that this institutional cycle has proven pretty successful, especially taking into account the difficult circumstances that we were facing. So thinking about the next institutional cycle, what will be the priorities? So you already mentioned competitiveness, and I think this is going to be very high on the agenda. And I mean, we already have clear hints that this is going to be the case because both Enrico Letta and Mario Draghi are working on reports on the single market and competitiveness. So it is clear that the European Commission will want to do something on this, and probably also the next EU Parliament. But there will still be some other priorities on the table. So the current commission intended to be a geopolitical commission. So we're already seeing some kind of an evolution between the different commissions. In 2014, Juncker spoke about a political commission in contrast to previous more technocratic commissions. In 2019, Ursula von der Leyen added these three letters, geopolitical commission. So I think this would also be on the agenda, and this will be very much linked to enlargement and also deepening of the EU. And finally, I think that the twin transitions will still be on the table. And I think that especially we are paying a lot of attention to the green transition, but personally, I think that we should also not lose sight of the digital transition, which is key for productivity and competitiveness. And this is something that we will discuss later on. Thank you.
Igor, you want to share your views as well?
Absolutely. And first of all, thank you for having me. It's a delight to be able to speak about these issues here. Yeah, I think looking back at what the Commission has achieved, what's interesting is we have already seen throughout the mandate a shift in the priorities that was driven largely by the successive crises that you mentioned. But it's clear that the ambitions laid down by the Green Deal at the very start of the mandate are not the one that are being pursued right now. And the scar of that is very visible. We can see that there are large chunks of what had been announced that have never been proposed, or colleagues working in the agri-food sector are still wondering where the food labeling initiatives have gone, or where the REACH revision is at the moment. So there has already been, I think, an adaptation from the European institutions of their priorities throughout the mandate, and it's probably an evolution in the same trajectory that we'll see for the next mandate. Lots remain on the table, and there will be a lot of bargaining around the definition of these objectives. We know that Ursula von der Leyen is now officially candidate, and we are also hearing that her date of election by MEPs may be postponed to accommodate some time to negotiate those priorities with the different political groups. So there is still a lot in the air, but I definitely have to agree with Judith that industrial strategy and competitiveness are going to be one of the key priorities of the mandate. We could see that already in a lot of the manifestos that have, or draft manifestos that have circulated around Brussels. So it's clear that this will be one of the key priorities, especially the defense aspect of this industrial strategy, where Europe is, I think, still behind the member states in European initiatives may help fill in the gap and really help the geopolitical commission and the geopolitical European Union come to. So this is definitely going to be part of the priorities. And then we can look at other things that can be on the agenda in the Eurobarometer published in December. The first priority for citizens was the cost of living, followed closely by other priorities that we know are in the agenda. But the cost of living is probably going to be an important issue, especially in relation to the inflationary trends that we have experienced in the past couple of years and the driving up of energy prices. Then the twin transition is definitely here to stay, maybe even more accentuating the aspects of twinning the green and digital transitions. This is something that has been quite consistent in the strategic foresight reports of Commissioner Šefčovič. The fact that in the future, the European Union will need to bring these two transitions together and synergize them to achieve real gains in both areas. And I think another priority that will be on the table is the budget and the financing and the issue of funding the transition, the industrial strategy, and the competitiveness of the European Union. The inflationary trends have also hurt the European budget a lot. This additional spendings led by the crisis has also depleted the reserves that the EU had in the MFF. And we know that in the next mandate, we'll start a new budgetary cycle. So there will be conversations around that and around how the EU intends to fund its ambitions. And lastly, and maybe also interesting for businesses, we're seeing simplification pushed on the top of the agenda by Ursula von der Leyen. It was already visible in the work program for this year, and it will probably remain on the agenda. And I'm very curious to see how the Commission intends to simplify in practice when its approach to the one in, one out principle was not quite obvious throughout the mandate. So overall, I'd say that there's still a lot of uncertainties around what exactly will be the priorities, but these topics are definitely in the air. And then there are also the review mechanisms that are important to consider, because some of the files are legally mandated to come back to the agenda. And I know that in our audience, we have a lot of people interested in digital, for instance, and we know that the first review of the DSA, DMA, the review of the GDPR copyright directive will already be back. We already know that they'll be back next mandate, whether or not that aligns with the political priorities that are set by the new Commission. So this is also something to keep in mind.
Thank you, Igor. Maybe following up with what you mentioned in the beginning of your intervention, you, of course, made a link to the Parliament as well, and how the dynamics are going to determine also the priorities and eventually the confirmation of Ursula von der Leyen as the president of the Commission. How do you see the shift in the political situation at the moment in Europe? I mean, already 5 years ago, we expected that there would be a rightward shift. Then it didn't really happen, but right now it might really become a reality. So how do you think that is going to have an impact on the strategic agenda of the next 5 years?
Well, it's clear right now that looking at the polls, there is this right-wingization of the European Parliament. The ECR and ID are looking stronger, whereas the Centre and the Greens are looking a bit weaker. There is a bit of a caveat that I'd like to mention on that, is that I looked up the polling figures for May 2019, and there is a 20-seat differential between what the Greens were polling in May and what they actually achieved in the European elections, and a 20-seat differential for Renew, which was another party that gained a lot of seats. So we don't have a full picture yet, and a lot of the political dynamics will come to play in the last weeks of the elections as the campaign really picks up. But I think what we're seeing at the moment is probably an indication of how things could unravel. And indeed, we're seeing the right wing being stronger in the European Parliament. We've heard a bit about a possible right wing majority. I don't buy into that scenario too much, but what is sure is that should the ECR really grow in size, the EPP will have a strong ally to leverage concessions out of a centrist majority. don't think a right-wing majority is a majority that can pilot common projects. There are still a lot of ideological and political discrepancies between political delegations in the Renew group and in the ECR, and national antagonisms that would probably prevent a long-term majority. But it's a very good majority to oppose projects and amendments that are being tabled by the other side of the European Parliament. So they will definitely have a stronger position. And the other thing to consider, besides the majority, is that it's always harder to change the proposals that are coming through the Parliament. So the starting point of the legislation will also be something to consider. If we look at the composition of governments from the member states and at the possible then composition of the European College of Commissioners, it's clear that we'll see more right-wing members of the college than we currently have, right-wing and center-right. So this will also impact the starting point of the legislation. It will be easier for the EPP to preserve the Commission's original text, harder for the SND to bring in amendments and try to steer this legislation in new directions. So I think that the more right-wing parliament will definitely matter. I don't think that it will have a dramatic change on how the parliament currently functions. I think it will probably be centered around the same majorities, but how this majority is able to express itself and how strong the EPP is in steering this majority will definitely change in the next mandate.
Thank you. Judith, do you agree with Igor's assessment?
Absolutely. I mean, I do fully agree with what he just stated. I don't think there will be major changes in how the European Parliament works, but we need to take into consideration that commissioners are in principle appointed by national governments. So on top of what will happen at the EU elections, since we are increasingly having more member states with more right-wing governments, the number of commissioners with this ideology will increase. So this will give, I think, that a lot of room of maneuver for the EPP to indeed keep their proposals, and less room of maneuver to S&D or to Renew or even the Greens to introduce amendments. So fully in agreement with his statement. I also think that probably ECR and ID will not come together. So there will probably be more of a tendency from the EPP to maybe work with ECR, still to be seen whether this cordon sanitaire is kept around ID. So I would tend to think that that indeed maybe the EPP starts working a bit more with ECR, still to be seen what will happen with ID. In any case, what we're seeing in the last few years is an increase in fragmentation in the also in the European Parliament. So in 2014, EPP and S&D had a majority. It changed in 2019, so they had to rely more on Renew, the Greens, and now things may change. But I would tend to think that this is more relevant for the European Commission than for the Parliament.
You both, thank you very much. And you both mentioned, of course, I think the realistic scenarios in terms of majorities and how the Parliament is going to function. But if you look back the current mandate, we have seen that the centrist coalition was very ambitious in terms of sustainability. And if you both agree, and I think we can all agree that the twin transition is going to remain as a priority, but sustainability will become even more controversial. Do you think that with the shift in the European Parliament, there will be more difficult to be more ambitious than it was before? Because we have seen the Parliament oftentimes put forward amendments that were even more ambitious than the Commission was. So if we see now sustainability is moving forward, would the Parliament keep this track, or do you think there will be some backwarding from the Parliament in terms of ambitions going forward with sustainability legislation?
Maybe I can reply. I think it's a very interesting question. I think we have lessons to draw from the recent 2040 targets communications. I think while maintaining the same level of broad ambitions that are enshrined in the European climate law and that are legally binding for the EU institutions, I think we're looking more at a shift in the method on how the European Union is looking at the possibilities to decrease GHG emissions. We can see in the 2040 targets that there is a much more pregnant role for carbon capture and usage, or carbon capture and storage, and other technological-driven solutions to curb the effects of to curb the emissions. And probably the level of ambitions in terms of the overall figures will be the same. How we get there and the level of ambitions to transform our economies and societies is probably what is going to be affected, and we'll probably have a shift of methods. Also, probably more flanking measures to support SMEs and businesses. We know that the EPP is very, very keen on supporting SMEs throughout this transition and other businesses at large. So probably more flanking measures, more funding available for businesses, and a more technologically and innovation-driven transition is what we would be looking at. And the fact that the S&D may lack the teeth to steer this in other directions, and the fact that we can expect the next commission to maybe not come forward with as ambitious a text, this will probably shift the outcome that we'll see. But it's true that we've seen mounting resistance to these higher ambitions throughout the mandate, culminating with the Naturation Law, which probably was one of the major political events that we went through this mandate, where the right wing of the European Parliament really tried to draw a line in the sand in terms of the regulatory advance of the European Green Deal. And they didn't quite have the figures then. They'll probably have it in the next mandate to oppose such new legislation and send a strong message to the Commission. And then we also have the role of the Council to consider. We're seeing a lot of setbacks on ambitious files once they reach the trilogue phase. I mean, as we speak, my colleagues are still trying to piece together what the due diligence directive or the platform work directive will come to. There's a lot of uncertainties on how the Council, or even the packaging regulation, on how the Council will stir these files and will react to the level of ambitions that have been included in those.
Maybe just one last follow-up question, Igor, and I pass the floor, of course, to Judith, because what you are mentioning, I also hear a lot of sense on a little bit of issue-based coalitions. Do you believe that that could be the future? Because that has an impact also on organizations that they try to influence, of course, legislation. Because I think in this term and the past terms, it was very obvious that if you want to get your amendment through, or you want to influence legislation, who did you need to turn to? But I think if it's becoming a reality that there will be some ad hoc coalitions, it would be even more difficult for organizations to see how they can make an impact on legislation.
Well, I think it's an interesting scenario, and I definitely see some merit in that. But the European institutions need some stability, and I think the European Parliament governance needs a more long-term majority. There are a lot of agreements that come together at the start of the mandate about the key positions and the allocations of files. That makes sense when they're driven by a cohesive or coherent, at least, a majority that remains coherent for the rest of the mandate. We'll probably see issue-based coalitions at the level of amendments. I'm not sure whether they'll come to at the level of text. The institutional reality is the Parliament is a compromise machine. And the wider the base of compromise, the better it is and the easier it is to pass this compromise through. When we look at the right-wing majority and the possibility for that, it would also be a very tight majority. Right now, if we put together the figures for Renew, EPP and ECR, they're coming 20 seats short of the new majority at 300. That's 361 MEPs. But even if we add some ID and non-attached member just to make the figures, it's going to be a very tight majority where any single MEP or delegation is empowered with important bargaining power to leverage more concessions from that tight majority. So it's not as easy to pilot as a broader majority, and definitely harder to whip. The NRL, the Natural Restoration Law, the attempt to block the natural law by the EPP was in fine tanked by, I think, 16 EPP members who decided not to follow Manfred Weber's the plan driven by Manfred Weber, and a little over half of the Renew delegation who decided to buy into Pascal Canfin's solution. So this would be very weak majority. So unless the issues are very polarizing to a point where the SND and the EPP cannot find common ground, I don't think there would be so much use for issue-based majority, which is probably a good thing for businesses because it means that they have a continuity in the interlocutors they have in the European Parliament, and that they can cultivate these relationship and reach out to the people they know in the Parliament, because they'll matter if the majority, if one majority is leading on most of the files.
Thank you. Do you share Igor's view, Judith?
Yeah, I largely share his views. I also think that when it comes to sustainability, not only in light of the new political majorities that will arise, but also in light of growing concerns from the industry, there will be discussions about sustainability and competitiveness. So I think that here the European Commission will probably make the case that sustainability increases competitiveness. For instance, they will probably make the case that wind and solar power deployment reduce electricity prices and thus inflation, that heat pump deployment, for instance, increases EU energy security, or that battery and electric engines improve public health. But in any case, I think that there's the elephant in the room as to whether this is really decreasing EU competitiveness and as to whether this is putting too much burden on companies. For instance, when I think about sustainable finance, all the requirements that are there, different pieces of legislation that sometimes they even overlap with each other. What I would personally like to see is an attempt to make this a linear process, while of course keeping an effort when it comes to sustainability. Of course, difficult for me to say whether this will be what will be pursued, but in any case, I think that there will for sure be a debate as to whether sustainability, sustainable finance, and competitiveness are compatible with each other, in light also of what's happening in other major jurisdictions like China and the US.
And it's really interesting what you are saying, because of course it's very clear that road towards decarbonization and net zero is costly. A lot of industries are suffering from the fact that they have to heavily invest into decarbonization, and the financial means may not be there if you compare it with the US IRA. And of course, the increasing tension with China as well. So do you think, if we can touch upon financial instruments as well, do you think that the current budget or the future budget, the new budget, would have to also look into other means of financial sources that is right now available for companies to become really not only sustainable, but also competitive vis-a-vis other parts of the world?
So in this regard, I think that it is important to make it clear that public investment is important, but more in a catalytic role, you know. So I produced a paper trying to compute the additional investment needs of the EU for the coming years, take into account digital green transition and also defense needs. It came up to more than 700 billion euros a year. But much of that will need to come from private means. So this absolutely calls, and this is a long-awaited priority, but we are not reaching the right outcome. We need a capital markets union. We need EU companies to rely on alternative funding sources. But on top of this, on top of having a green capital markets union, and on top of putting on the table the right files, we also need to green the banking sector. And this is something that I fail to see. And I don't know whether this will be a priority for the next European Commission. I do believe that, for instance, in Mario Draghi's report on competitiveness and even on Leta's report on the EU single market, they will discuss the need to integrate highly fragmented financial markets. But then we need to have the political will to go down that road. For instance, a few months ago, France and Germany tabled a joint roadmap on the future of the Capital Markets Union. And to me, it was not the most ambitious roadmap I've seen in my life. I think that everybody has very clear in their minds what the main building blocks of a Capital Markets Union will be, which would probably be to further harmonize insolvency frameworks, corporate legislation, tax laws, but this is nowhere to be seen. So I think that we would need to find how to catalyze those private investments. Then regarding your point on the EU budget being stretched, it's going to be very, very stretched. And not only because we need to fund and we need to have these public investments for the future, for the transitions, to catalyze private investment, we also need to rebuild Ukraine. And depending on what happens with the next US administration, we will see whether we have support from the US to fund the reconstruction of Ukraine. We are already seeing a lot of trouble from the US unleashing this more than $60 billion package. So this is something the EU cannot do on its own. Even if we think about additional own resources, this is difficult to see. This is difficult to happen. And finally, you also mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act. So many people tend to think that we are simply putting less funds on the table when it comes to if we compare it with the Inflation Reduction Act. And I don't think that's the case. So if we take into account all the funds for the green transition in the EU that comes from Next Generation EU, coupled with the funds coming from national regional administrations, we are very much in line with this $369 billion that the US has put on the table. The main difference is the way those funds are channeled into our economies. And here, I think that in the US, they make things simpler. And they make things simpler because it's a single country compared to 27 member states in the EU. So basically, in the US, they do this at the federal level, and they also use tax credits. Mm. And then they have introduced a number of protectionist measures, which I myself being a European, I don't like. What's the difference with the EU? In the EU, I mean, it's not easy for a company to know, unless it's a very big company that can rely on consultants, on external consultants. It's not so easy to know with which public administration you need to get in touch to. Then you also need to go through very long tender procedures, which to some extent are pretty uncertain. So I would tend to think that it would be good to use more tax credit measures, although in some EU member states they have not proven that successful on the basis of Next Generation EU, but they should be better designed, and I think that tax credits are indeed a good road to follow. And I think that we should also make a joint effort at the public administration level when it comes to transparency. I think that we should have a common web page accessible for a company, for instance, dealing with digitization, to know what public tenders are available at the different levels. Of course, this is easier said than done, but I think that it's worth trying. Thank you.
Thank you, Judith. Igor, do you have thoughts on this as well? You're muted.
I have plenty of thoughts on that. I think that was a lot of very interesting points. And we have seen that the Capital Markets Union and all of the files that have been attached under that big pillar have been pushed in the Commission and generally well received in the European Parliament, where progress was more tedious was in the Council. And I think that's where we tend to see a lack of ambition, not only on the financial sector, but on the question of financing in general. MEPs are generally in favor of larger EU budgets and of giving more money to fund the European ambitions, and it's the Council and the member states that tend to react adversely to those proposals. So this is going to be a very interesting dialogues between the three institutions, where we'll see how the EU intends to fund its ambitions. I think that's the key link when we're talking about sustainability and competitiveness. It's, do we put enough financing for European companies to get up to the EU regulatory standards and have the capabilities to capitalize on these regulatory efforts and actually bring in new markets and create jobs. I come from background in the trade sector, where the EU's communication has always been about jobs and about trade creates jobs. And I think we'll probably have the same type of communication about competitiveness and green competitiveness, that it creates jobs, but we need to make sure that there are enough finances and financing in the EU for this to actually happen. And when it comes to the ways in which we finance the European Union growth, I think the European Union probably needs to have a proper conversation about competition rules, because the US are not playing fair, China is not playing fair, and the EU is probably one of the only markets who still abide by the liberal ideal of competition rules, where when you're the only one doing that, it's, you put shooting a bullet in your foot at the start of the race. So whether it goes through extraterritorial or unilateral measures to make sure that our trade partners are playing by the same rules, or by changing the rules, the European Union will need to eventually look at that. And again, this is something where in the Council a lot of tensions could appear, because we know that already the few times we talked about subsidies, these mandates, some Nordic countries came up and were very vocal about that. And it's true that there is a differential in the capacity to actually produce subsidies in the EU, and that it wouldn't be a great route for harmonization. But I think the issue of financing will definitely be one of the key issues. We can see, will definitely be one of the key issues. It's in the Greens manifesto, who call for a European Green Deal fund equal to 1% of the EU GDP. It's in the EPP's draft manifesto, where they're calling for investments for innovation and jobs. So this is going to be a key issue. How much funds are made available, and what rules are implemented to make sure that these funds are able to transfer to generate more private investment.
Thanks, Igor. I think the key is what you mentioned. Financing is going to be the key for the next term. And also Judith mentioned, of course, the two very important reports that are in the making by former Italian Prime Ministers Letta and Draghi. So if we can speculate, or you can speculate now, I think, can you name 3 issues that you think for sure going to be in the report? Maybe Judith, start with you.
Yeah.
On top of financing, because I think we agreed on that financing is going to be there.
I will now answer to your question, but if I may, just to follow up on one Igor's point. So on state aid, well, I think I'm a bit worried about what's happening with the state aid rules right now in the EU. So also having a look at the temporary frameworks that the Commission has passed, and even this provision that would allow state aid to match the state aid that a company would get in the US under IRA to avoid this delocalization or relocation of companies from the EU to the US. So I do fully understand where the Commission is coming from. But the problem is that if you do that with member states with very different fiscal capacities, then you're simply breaking the internal market. And if we have a look at who has benefited from this provision I was mentioning on the IRA, it's been Germany, who has put on the table more than 900 million euros for a Swedish company. So, I mean, nothing to say against that. I know that we're in a highly geopolitical, complicated world, but then we need a common fiscal capacity. I know that this may be a bit unpopular for some Northern European member states, but if you break the internal market like that, we will finally only have national champions of two member states. And this is also somehow proven by a letter drafted by Margrethe Vestager, who said that if I recall correctly, under the previous temporary framework, 80% of the volume of state aid came from Germany and France. So it's okay that we need to fight and not to fight, but we need to be aware of what world we are currently living in, and then that other major jurisdictions are making use of state aid. But at the same time, we also need to preserve our internal market, which has been a source of welfare for the EU. And now, sorry, moving to your question, Victoria. So I would. Coming to the diagnosis, I would tend to see, or what I would like to see is a diagnosis about how the productivity in the EU has, or the productivity gap of the EU vis-a-vis other major jurisdictions like the US has increased in the last few decades, and how this is somehow linked to an investment gap in digitization. So if we have a look at the data, and this has also been made very clear by Isabel Schnabel, one of the members of the executive committee of the ECB, a gap has emerged in IT-related capital stock between the EU and the US. One of the reasons for that is the size of companies in the EU. So we have a look at companies in the US. 60% of US companies in the US with more than 250 employees are creating 60% of employment, whereas in the EU, depending on the member state, that can vary between 12% to 37%. So of course, companies which are bigger, which have more financial muscle, can invest much more in new technologies, in IT. And another reason, I think, are education gaps. So basically, on top of the financing and from both sides, from the private sector side and from the public sector side, I would tend to see pretty many references on education. So on this need to move from a lab to FAB. So in the EU, we are pretty at the top when it comes to production of top research. But the problem is that then this finds no business, no relationship with business. So I would tend I would like to see kind of relationship between this needs to really put research to the service of what our businesses need, and to try to find a better link between research and innovation in the business world. And I will also tend to see references to digitization, to the need for our businesses to incorporate top technologies in their day-to-day business. This is very much also related to the digital compass, and to one of the four pillars of the digital compass. So if I only have to choose three, I would then go for the financing, the education part, research, innovation, education part, and finally to digitization. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edith. Igor, your top three priorities, or according to you, what will be in the report actually?
Well, I think the priority that Judith just mentioned are indeed really important. I think the social dimension, and I'm also seeing questions in the chat about that, the social dimension will be a very important one in the next mandate. It's probably on top of the S&D's agenda, and it's also in transparency in the EPP's manifesto as well. I mean, we know that this issue is here and around, but what we also know is that in the past, the EU has had very mitigated successes to intervene in social affairs. There is a lack of competency on the one hand, and on the other, there are resistances from member states and from national political delegations as well. That's where we can see the majority break up sometime as well, is when national issue transcend the horizontal political platforms that are in the European Parliament. If we take an example from actually the end of last mandate, the mobility package and the rules that it's tried to harmonize on drivers was a very, very high tension file. I still remember truckers being everywhere, just like we had farmer demonstrations a few weeks ago. And right now, the attempt at the Platform Work Directive is also again showing that member states are not keen to harmonize social conditions too much, which is going to be a problem if Europe intends to be strong and to curb the disintegration of some parts of the single market due to crisis, to international competition. We eventually will need to move towards more harmonization. And I think the two areas where we're lacking at the moment is, as Judith mentioned, on fiscal rules and taxation and fiscal capacities, and on the other hand, on the social policy. So I do think that these the social aspects will be important. However, unless we see a joint political will emerge in the next mandate, I struggle to see how we can have positive developments in that area without too much tension rising in the council or in the parliament.
I see. Yeah, that's an interesting point. And indeed, we had a question from the audience about social issues, and then the fact that it's not really a commission competency. And then we see a lot of industries raised at the bottom, and what kind of impact does it have on general industries? So yes, let's hope that indeed in the reports we will see it coming back and it will be addressed. And then, of course, there is a political will, as you said, by the member states as well, to really pick this up and take action on this, and not just what we see so far, pointing fingers with each other on the commission, and see how this will evolve in the future. I see a few questions from the audience as well, and there are some questions really related on technical issues regarding legislation and legislative process in the future. I also see one question regarding the changes in the Directorate Generals in the Commission. Do you have a vision if there will be some new DGs created, or there will be merges of the current Directorate Generals? How do you see the future setup of the Commission? Will we see 27 commissioners actually, or are we going to have less? That's also, I think, still an open issue.
I can maybe start, yeah. I think that's a very good question. First, I think that what will change is a change in the portfolios of commissioners. That is definitely going to happen. We know that there are calls from the civil society for vice president on industrial issues, whether it's industrial strategy or competitiveness, but someone who has this capacity and this capability to harmonize work on industrial issues across the European Commission, much like Frans Timmermans worked on that from the Green perspective. So there is definitely room for new portfolios. We know that other civil society organizations are calling for a vice president or commissioners in the food sector, because right now the work is very much divided between DG Santé, DG Agri, and even in the parliament between Envy and Agri. So there is a need, and businesses need a coherent regulatory environment, and the Commission's way to achieve that, at least in the very short term, is the vice president portfolios that are more horizontal in nature and go across the different sections. As to changes in Directorate General, I think beyond the political will, there's also an administrative perspective to consider. It's a very hazardous task and tedious task to merge administrative units together, especially when they're the size of some of the DGs. But it's not impossible either. We have seen during this mandate DG Grow restructure to be able to have this supply chain approach, and with these different sectors rising. We have seen the creation of a new position within the Director General for Trade as the Chief Trade Enforcement Officer. So I'm not sure that merging or splitting DGs will necessarily be the way to go for the European Commission, but adjustments within DGs to better capture some issues is very much in the realm of what we could expect, especially, for instance, if what Ursula von der Leyen is calling for a defense commissioner, there's going to have to be somewhere in the Commission where these defense issues can be treated. And there might be a bit of overlap and clashes with the EAS as well when that is created. But so administrative change is definitely on the table in the Commission and in the Parliament. We know that the EPNV created a subcommittee on health issues that probably could live on as a different committee. We know that civil society organizations are also calling for the division or rearrangement of responsibilities of the different committees. We have committees that are very interesting from that point of view. The ITRE committee, depending on whether we're talking about a digital file or an energy file, you won't see the same MEPs in the room. And you have really these two faces of the same committee, which from an institutional point of view, we can wonder if that's the best solution and the most efficient way to push legislation through the European Parliament. Yeah, I think we can expect some of these changes. I was looking if there was any other questions in the chat.
There was a follow-up question on the food, what you actually also mentioned. Indeed, that's kind of expected. That there will be a vice presidency or just a commissioner, of course, who can merge that from Sante and from agriculture as well.
Oh, yeah, I think you mentioned as well whether we would have 27 commissioners. I looked into the treaties recently. We need 21 as per the treaties. But I wonder who's going to announce to a member state that they're not getting a commissioner this time around. So I think
for that, indeed, what they get in return. Right?
Yes. I mean, we'll see the big negotiations that we always see at the start of the mandates. So I wonder if that's going to be possible and if member states will keep the opportunity to get a commissioner and how that's going to be repaid in a way in the negotiations.
To me, this idea of having less than 27 commissioners this time around is totally out of the question. So I'm aware of this provision. I think that it's 2/3 of at least 2/3 of commissioners. I think that this provision will be probably explored in case of an enlargement of the EU, in case we had a EU of plus 30 member states, because I mean there are a lot of ideas floating around, like having senior commissioners, union commissioners, which to me would totally break up with the principle of collegiality. So I think that this provision of 2/3 will be probably explored in the case we have additional member states and a relevant number of additional member states. Otherwise, to me, this is politically toxic. I don't think this is something that one would like to explore. And as for new commissioners or executive vice president on food, I mean, I fully see where this is coming from. So we have a look at open strategic autonomy and the different aspects that this encompasses. Of course, food is one of them, right? But we have not discussed economic security. So this is something that we have not touched upon, but which is also very high on the agenda. The Commission has put several packages on the table, which will, of course, make it into the next institutional cycle. So I would not be surprised to see a commissioner in charge of economic security, and that embedding, for instance, food and other aspects of economic security. Also very much in agreement with Igor on what he said on industry. And I am also looking and following very closely, since I'm mostly an expert in financial regulation, as to what's going to happen with the commissioner for FISMA. So now there are some pleas for a regulatory pause when it comes to financial services. So in case this is going to be pursued, let's see whether FISMA is kept as or FISMA competences are not merged with another commissioner.
Thank you, Judith. I think it's super interesting. And indeed, you mentioned economic security. I think that would worth another webinar, which maybe we should do to talk about only economic security and the future of the EU in that regard. There is also a question, I think, Judith, that you can answer the best. Generally, what kind of role do you think will be ascribed to the financial sector under the new mandate? And I see a couple of participants who are interested in this issue. I think it's now on the screen, so you can see it as well.
Well, I think that the financial sector, as I was saying before, has a very important role to play. I talked about a regulatory pause in the financial services area just a minute ago, but at the same time, if you have a look at all the review clauses included in legislative pieces that Igor mentioned before, in the financial services sector is more than 50. So basically, if you think that you have an institutional mandate of 5 years, you have more than 50. This makes 10 revised pieces of legislation per year. So take into account that you have like 2 months off every year. So it makes one revised piece of legislation tabled by the Commission in the financial services sector every month during the next institutional cycle. So personally, I would argue very much in favor of some sort of elimination of regulatory overlap, especially when it comes to sustainable finance. I think that a great push will be given to the Capital Markets Union, but I am not so sure as to what to expect with this, because the Capital Markets Union has been on the table since 2015, and a lot of legislative files have been passed, more than 10. But still, we are very far from having integrated capital markets. Then when it comes to the banking union, we have some toxic topics on the table that political masters don't want to discuss. And I'm thinking about European Deposit Insurance Scheme or a mechanism for the provision of liquidity and resolution. So technical work has been done in that regard, that's clear, but this is something that political masters simply do not want to discuss. So I would like also to, and I would like to see this in the reports also by Letta and Draghi, and also in the priorities of the next Commission, what non-toxic elements could be brought to the table to ensure that our banking sector is not so fragmented. Because, I mean, when I think about KYC procedures that are very different depending on the member state you're thinking of, when I also think about a total lack of integration of credit markets, I think that there's a lot of work that can be done to further integrate our banking sector, but it's not high in the agendas, and it's not even in the agenda. So I think that everybody will look to the financial sector when it comes to funding all these new needs and the reconstruction of Ukraine and everything. But on top of also requesting this from the financial sector, I think that regulators need to put solutions on the table to make this feasible.
Correct. Igor? You're muted.
Yeah, I generally agree with that, and I think the progress on financial markets, as I've said earlier, is very slow. I mean, since the Juncker Commission, we're pushing on and on and on the Capital Markets Union, and I think that on that, and that's a very general remark, we're seeing a lot of legislation pass, but the devil, as always, is in the implementation and the actual enforcement of the legislation that's being passed. If we want to see progress on the harmonization of the internal market and the emergence of the business environment that's created by this legislation, or at least that this legislation aimed at creating. So coherence and implementation, I think, go hand in hand. And the other thing is, when you're trying to build a capital markets union for such a long time, as we've seen this mandate, the priorities and the level of ambitions varies a lot. So it's not necessarily this. You don't necessarily see a very coherent picture emerge as political support kind of wanes or strengthens depending on the ongoing momentum and political events that are affecting the positions of the different parties and member states. So in that, I think that the financial sector will remain important. As you said, we have legislation that needs to come through to be reviewed. if the Commission can consolidate that and make the rules that exist clearer and the new rules work better with the existing ones, I think that would be best. I don't think that's where the Commission has excelled this mandate. And to be honest, the simplification was already in the air at the start of the mandate. The new interinstitutional agreement enshrined simplification principles that were never really put into practice. I think it's also very hard for the Commission to account for the modifications that will come from the Parliament and the Council that can create, and that's where we can see sometimes overlap and doubling of legislation emerge from that co-legislative phase, where the Commission is most of the time trying to create a coherent environment. This is going to be a very interesting issue, and I'm very interesting to see how a Commission, if Ursula von der Leyen is indeed president of the next Commission, how she will bring about simplification where she didn't manage to bring it about during this mandate.
Yeah. No, it's yeah, you're totally right. I cannot agree more. And I think we could go on over and over all these issues, and we haven't even been able to touch on many things that I think we could continue this webinar for hours long. And I see there are a lot of questions from the audience that we were not able to address, and we are running out of time. So I would like to suggest that maybe we will set up a follow-up of this webinar, and then I hope that, of course, the participants are interested to rejoin us, and then we can continue this discussion because it's extremely insightful. So I would like to thank you for your participation and sharing your thoughts with us, and also thank you for the audience for being with us today and also posing questions. And again, I promise that we will look into an opportunity to continue our discussions. Before wrapping up of this webinar, I would like to just announce that today we are also launching a report called Beyond the Ballot Elections Report that you all participants will receive in your mailboxes following the session. And then it will be also available for download from our website for everyone interested. Also for the audience, I would like to thank for joining us today. Should you be interested of learning more about elections, please join our second webinar that we will organize, but also follow us on social media and also sign up for our newsletters. You can also listen to our podcast where we are digging even deeper on subjects with our own experts. And on the 21st of March, we already have a date for the next webinar, but that is focusing on the Belgian elections. So please feel free to join as well. Thank you very much for our speakers today, Judith and Igor, for joining us and for your thoughts. I hope the audience also enjoyed being with us today. And I wish you all a nice day and see you next time then. Bye.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.